Real Country 1430 AM and 107.3 FM WRDN. Brian Winnikins from World Dairy Expo. Thank you to our expo sponsors, including Alcivia Co-op, Osteoplastics, Bauer Seeds and Service, UtterTech, and BioVet. Joining us is Tanner Ehmke. He is with CoBank, and CoBank's getting ready to do a big release on commodities, where we're at, and how things are going. And Tanner does the dairy section, so appropriate here at World Dairy Expo. Tanner, thanks for joining us. We've been hearing reports, at least as of late, butter getting short. Have you heard that too?
It's the news of the day. Record high butter prices last quarter. And butter prices have remained fairly resilient, surprisingly, because of, as you said, Brian's very tight stocks out there. And the question is to why, and is that going to change? Obviously, because that's going to change the price outlook. And we had a less than impressive spring flush earlier this year. If you're not familiar with how the butter industry operates, a lot of that butter is made during the spring flush and then put into big, gigantic freezers, which they hold throughout the year until they start staging it in the fall for the big holiday season. So all the production, or most of the production rather, happens in the spring. Most of the consumption happens in the holiday season in the last quarter, in Q4. And so the retailers, the grocery stores and whatnot, they try to stage that inventory, if you will, in advance before the consumer is there ready to start making cookies and doing their home baking. Well, there was a scramble because all the retailers are a little concerned about supply availability. Butter stocks are very, very tight because so much of our milk in this country increasingly goes to cheese. And when you're short on the spring flush, if you don't get the supplies that you need, it's usually butter that's going to get the short end of the stick, if you will. The butter plants are going to idle. They're going to see the downtime, whereas the cheese plants won't. And so economics 101, production goes down, supplies go down, prices go up. And here we are at record high prices, or very high prices. We've come off the highs a little bit, but still very stable, over $3. And so I think we're going to see some very strong butter prices going forward. That's sort of the main contributor as to why we have such high Class 4 prices, why Class 4 milk is trading at a premium to Class 3 milk, which is for cheese. And so that's going to be sustained through the next quarter. We think by the end of the quarter, we're finally going to see butter prices come down because that's when the consumer stops buying or they stop their holiday consumption. And so we'll probably see some softening of butter prices there, and some of the pressure will come off of Class 4 prices a little bit. But still, though, we're still very, very tight. And amidst all this tightness, remember, it's not just the U.S. consumer that's consuming U.S. butter. We've got the international consumer that's also buying U.S. butter, especially places like Canada, the Middle East. And why are they coming to the United States? Well, the story now turns to Europe. And Europe has struggled with their production issues, both politically and with weather. And so they've had to step back from the export market for butter there. We have filled that demand. And so that has added further pressure on butter. The thing going forward, I think, that's going to add a little bit more softening, if you will, to butter prices is not only post-holiday consumption dropping off, but we've also seen very strong imports as well, especially coming in from Ireland. So I think that's going to take the top off of butter prices, if you will, and keep it a little bit more moderate. But still, butter prices are very strong, and we see that lasting at least through the end of the quarter.
Talking with Tanner Ehmke with CoBank. You know, Tanner, USDA just came out here just recently about dairy consumption in the U.S. approaching 1959 levels with, total cheese, butter, fluid milk. Is that another factor in all of this, especially with on the butter side, but even on the cheese side of just demand has really gone up even here in the United States?
Absolutely. Dairy products across the board, with some exceptions, generally have a very resilient demand story. And when you look at the consumption trends across all the products, beverage milk, fluid milk being the exception, they continually go up per capita every year. And so, that's a trend that's going to remain intact because we're talking about affordable lifestyle choices. People like the taste of fat, number one. Number two, consumers want protein. And what do dairy products offer? Fat and protein. And so the U.S. consumer has been loath to let go of dairy products. Once they add dairy products into their diet, it's not often that they step back. Of course, I mentioned fluid milk is the exception there. That's more, again, a lifestyle choice. Consumers aren't sitting down at the breakfast table anymore and having that bowl of cereal like they used to. They're eating their breakfast in a car. And what are they eating? Perhaps a protein bar that has whey in it, right? So, again, a shift there, but that would be the one exception. And so you've got these dynamics where the consumer wants that fat, the consumer wants that protein, and even during a recession, they see that as an affordable, if not necessity, perhaps even a luxury. They say, you know, I can afford to have some full-fat ice cream because I deserve it. And they're not going to trade down. And so those demand trends are going to stay intact. I would say the big concern going forward, if on the demand side, we want to take a look on the export market, especially with countries like China. China's economy has been a little bit concerning here of late, and that's been reflected in GDT prices overseas because the Chinese are slowing down their purchases. So I'd say the demand story is not 100% full throttle going forward. We've got to watch countries like China to see what happens with exportability.
Talking with Tanner Ehmke with CoBank. Meanwhile, Tanner, on the supply side or the production side, it's always kind of been, okay, so we start seeing milk prices rising, and that's when dairy farmers are like, oh, it's time to add a few more cows, or maybe let's add on to the parlor, things like that. But because of input costs, supply chain issues, they're not doing that. Is that contributing to all? Is that going to continue to contribute to this tight supply of butter, of potentially cheese, of things like that? Because it is kind of surprising here that we're not seeing a big jump in cow numbers or dairy production.
That's absolutely the story that's been the theme of 2022. We see that playing out into 2023, where although milk prices at current levels traditionally would have been deemed very enticing because of the cost situation on production, that has held the entire U.S. herd back from achieving those higher growth rates. Now, when you look at the USDA milk production report, start taking apart those numbers, you start to see some nuance there. Some states are just growing phenomenally. And it's the traditional cast of characters: Texas, South Dakota, some of the plains states continually add more and more to the dairy herd, whereas other states, especially on the coastal areas, are struggling more with cost. And so that's where we're seeing the recovery in the growth pace of the U.S. dairy herd is in those central states because they have a lower cost of production, lower regulatory hurdles. And so going forward, that's something you got to watch. In the last milk production report, it was a little surprising how much the herd recovered in terms of not just its size, but its productivity as well. And so it's a little bit of a bearish report there. And that's something we're going to need to watch. Now, that was one report. We're going to have to watch several reports in order to really establish a trend. But I'd say that's an early sign that perhaps in some of these areas, especially in the central U.S., where recovery is happening at a faster pace, it's just that nationwide you see so many other producers struggling with these costs of productions, especially with feed and with labor, material costs. You mentioned if you want to add a new parlor, you're going to have to buy stainless steel and concrete, which are high in price as well. So you're going to have to keep an eye on that. But I'd say this migration of the herd inland is probably going to be that upside potential in some areas where we add more cow numbers than perhaps the market had anticipated.
That is Tanner Ehmke with CoBank from World Dairy Expo. I'm Brian Winnikins for WRDN.